my sneaking suspicion is that we all can do a little bit better in this area. Um, the great thing is that interviewing is really no different than having quality conversations, whether that's with our people, our family, friends, whatever that looks like. Um, and a lot of times it comes down to no one's ever taught us how to have these conversations. Sometimes they're difficult conversations, sometimes they're they're entertaining conversations from the vantage point of there's no pressure. It's all really more of a personal connection. Um, if you've been in any of my previous trainings or conversations around interviewing or performance reviews, any of these high stakes types of conversations that we all have to do in our business, you've heard me mention Trey Gowdy and It Doesn't Hurt to Ask. That is the book that our training today is going to come out of. And quite frankly, this is a big conversation, so we're not going to land the plane today. This is just setting really the foundation and starting to fortify the strategy of showing up to these meetings, showing up to these sometimes uncomfortable or difficult conversations the best way. So with today's conversation and training, it's really about setting the foundation. And one thing that I want everybody to kind of come prepared into this is not feeling like you have been doing it wrong, but you've been doing it without enough tools. Whether we're talking about HVAC or plumbing, construction, or technology, if you don't have the right tools, it's hard to be successful. And not to say that you can't do the job, but it may take longer or it may take more steps in the process if not having the right tools to deploy versus having everything at your disposal and just knowing how to use it. So, with that, let me go ahead and get us started. And this is one of those that I'm going to ask for either some participation in kind of role playing or being honest in the chat or visually if you're on camera today, uh, being just very transparent. This is a group of business owners that we want to get better. That's why we show up every week. And for this conversation, we want to get better at what matters, which is interviewing. One thing that doing this for really almost a decade and a half at this point, you understand that when you get put into a leadership role, whether that's a manager, supervisor, director, or business owner, and you start hiring people, no one hires or no one trains you on how to hire people. No one trains you on how to have these bigger, more high stakes rounds of conversation. It's almost assumed if you go from a technician or an operator to an interviewer and hiring manager, you just supposed to know. That's how it works. You all of a sudden know how to interview. And what I would say to anybody that's on this training, you don't know what you don't know, and it's not your fault, but it is your responsibility. And so that is what we're going to equip you with today in really what will become a three-part series. So it's going to be really imperative that you watch all three, whether that's live on this training and you have the access to ask questions and get deeper dialogue, or you show up for the remainder of this series. But I think this is one of those topics that we don't talk about a ton in business, and then we wonder why our biggest expense is the one that we don't get invoiced for, and that's our turnover. We know on average from Harvard Business Review studies that on average it costs us 133% of that person's salary or wage to replace them. So if you have high turnover, and high turnover statistically is anything above 25%. So if you have more than 25% involuntary turnover, this is not involuntary turnover where we're refining the leadership or the level of our leadership inside of our business, but that involuntary turnover where they are either getting fired or they're leaving on their own volition. If it's higher than 25%, you can calculate that based on your total W-2s issued the previous year, and that number will probably require you to get a new piece of gum because you just swallowed it. But you're never going to get an invoice for it. So that's why it makes sense to get in this room, get on this training, and let's learn something together and then deploy it together. And then if we can extract an additional profitability, maybe it's 5%, maybe it's 50% out of every dollar that we earn in revenue without generating an additional dollar in revenue, that's where I want to get us from a people strategy and human capital management. So let me get my screen shared and we'll jump right in. So very intentional in the title of today's training. Interview like your business depends on it because it doesn't hurt to ask. You have an opportunity as a leader, as a hiring manager. Everything that the candidate wants, that team member wants, is on the other side of difficult questions. And the more we're willing to ask the hard questions, the tough questions, is the better we're going to do when it comes to being able to extract the most amount of value, not only from the person, but for the person. So just kind of throwing out this idea, we want to reflect first. We always want to start from a place of looking back to where we've come from before we move forward. So if we're being honest, reflect on a recent interview you conducted that you did not take a strategic approach to the conversation. Deep breath, everybody. I think this is most of our interviews. If we're all being honest, if you've worked with Altru for any length of time, you've been either equipped already or you're currently building out your interview scorecards for your interviews. What we find statistically is less than 20% of interviews are done or conducted with a plan, which is scary. If we're building out a team and we have high expectations that we're building a high performance team, and yet we're not intentional on the roster that we're building, not to throw any shade towards the Marlins, but they are notorious for throwing their roster together with a lack of clarity and a lack of strategy, and it's all based on budget. If we're being honest, there have been a lot of budget hires in our business where maybe we don't have the cash flow to offer full salary for this business or for this position, or maybe not the highest or most attractive hourly rate. And so we're hiring with our budget versus the intention. We can do both, but really my intention for this is by the end that you'll have the tools and resources to ask purposeful questions, be able to unearth a lot of the truths that exist inside of those candidates or your team members that you're leading, build influence. If you spend any time around me, whether past or future, you will hear me talk about John Maxwell. He's been a mentor of mine for really the last 8, 9 years. I've read probably every book that he's written from that point on, but one of my favorite books is Becoming a Person of Influence. He talks about how we build our leadership by influence, and one of my favorite quotes from him is, if you call yourself a leader and nobody follows, you're simply a man on a lonely walk. And I think a lot of times we get saddled with this title of manager, or sometimes even we're called or we call ourselves a leader, and yet we don't have anybody following us. We simply have people reporting to us. I want you to be able to lead with clarity and using the power of the Socratic questioning and intentional listening and persuasive dialogue as a strategy. I will tell you very candidly, and sometimes I get pushback, or I don't know, pushback. I get razzed a little bit by my willingness to deploy all of my communication strategies inside the four walls of my home. Um, and I will tell you that whether it's dating a girlfriend, boyfriend, or it is dating a spouse, this stuff is magical. Um, you can create huge dialogue, valuable dialogue inside of whether we're talking to a team member or we're talking to a spouse on a weekly or monthly date. These strategies are tried and true because they're not based on the way that I feel about things. They're based on human psychology and really leveraging what we've innately been born with in yearning and desiring human connection. So, kind of setting the foundation between persuasion and inquiry or questioning. So, for context, looking left to right, we have the tone. When we're interrogating our participants in our conversations, it comes across as us being accusatory or making accusations, feels forceful. I think we've all been around at least one person in our life that, while they're coming across with maybe open-ended questions or questions, the tonality that they deliver that comes across almost as if we're being put under accusation or forceful. When it's a conversation, so making the shift to conversation, it should be curious, it should be respectful. I I like to think of, and I'm kind of aging myself a little here, but back in the 80s, there was a show called Columbo, and it was a detective and kind of this murder mystery type of show. But he always came from this place of curiosity, even if he knew the answers. When he was making his investigations, it was always from a place of curiosity. And I would say that that is a healthy place to begin your conversations, from this place of genuine curiosity or an inquisitory nature of trying to glean information. What's the goal? In interrogation, it's to extract information awfully quickly or under pressure. It's the stereotypical bullet point, very dominant personality that most of us have a tendency to have. It's 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 not a liability until it is, and in a lot of ways of leadership, it is absolutely an asset. But we have to be mindful of the fact that if we don't understand how we communicate or the communication style of our listener, we can come across as very uh, pressure filled instead of coming from a perspective of understanding their perspective and building genuine connection. Structurally, it comes across as rigid, scripted, confrontational, when if we're leading a conversation, it should be adaptive to the communication style of the hearer, of that listener. It should be responsive and collaborative in nature, bringing them into the conversation versus talking at them. We as leaders, managers, directors, supervisors, we typically need answers quickly, but we need to be adaptive in that nature where we're addressing the person that we're talking to. You've heard me in past trainings talk about the DISC assessment and really understanding communication style. We know statistically that most business owners, most people in that entrepreneurial journey fall in that high dominance, high D on the DISC profile, which realistically is only 3%. So 3 out of every 100 fall in that bucket as their primary nature of communication. Congratulations, you're special, but congratulations, you're a liability to all the communication breaking down in your business. So understanding both sides of the liability and the giftedness that you have. What we also need to understand is 7 out of our 10 team members fall in a very supportive or stabilizer mentality or personality, meaning they need context before they move forward. They need to know why before they need to know how. So understanding who we're talking to and then how to talk to them is vitally important in this journey. Emotional impact. I know all of the men on this training, this is not attractive to you because who wants to talk about your emotions? But here's the deal. We have 141 plus emotions to navigate on a daily basis. And the reality is that every one of the people that you interact with, whether you're in touch with your own or not, have them. And they will flux between multiple different types of emotion in a daily basis. So, an interrogation versus conversation, it can feel very invasive if you are speaking to them in bullet points or driving home towards a conclusion that you haven't gotten clarity on where they are. It creates defensiveness. A moment of clarity, moment of honesty for everybody. Have you ever felt when you come in hot to a conversation that you've gotten points of resistance where walls go up? If you haven't, then you're just not aware of it. And that's a whole different training that we haven't gotten to. But if you have people that are putting up walls and barriers emotionally between you and the answers that you desire, that's less about the hearer and more about the speaker. But if we're generating a conversation, it creates safety, it creates openness, it creates a dialogue that is genuinely dynamic in nature. And then we can control the dynamic. In an interrogation, it's one sided. It's me talking at you, it's me talking to you, but really only one of us is talking and neither one of us is listening. And I think that second part is where we can get frustrated as quote unquote leaders, and I use that very sparingly, but we can get frustrated as leaders when we talk at people and we're not getting the adoption or implementation or execution that we're desiring. The conversation in a controlled dynamic is a shared dialogue with mutual agency, mutual buy in from both sides or three sides or however many people are engaged in this conversation. When we create a conversation and we control that dynamic from a point of leadership where we're talking to the hearers, we're taking in consideration where they're listening from, we get a shared dialogue. And then result. This is the part that every one of us on this call as leaders, this is what we're shooting for every time we have a conversation. We would rather not have the conversation if we could get the results without the conversation, but people will people, and so we have to have conversations. But if we're in an interrogative state, if we work from a place of just driving towards those results, we often get surface level compliance or even resistance. How many of us have had in our daily, whether this is home or at work, where somebody agrees in person and yet doesn't execute? If you reflect on how many times or who you're getting this resistance from, what I would encourage you to do is go back. If you've had your team assessed on the DISC assessment, if you haven't, raise your hand, send us a message, get us involved. We can help you in assessing your team. but go back and look at their communication style. Because I would venture to tell you that if you're seeing compliance to your face and resistance behind your back, or when you separate from that person physically, 9 times out of 10, or if I want to be more exact, 8.6 times out of 10, these individuals that you're talking to are analytical. They're cerebral in nature. They're very contemplative in nature. They're the C in disc, or they're the S in disc, where they need support, they need additional context before taking action. But if we're having the conversation with these individuals, we're getting deeper insight, we're getting trust, we're getting genuine understanding of what that action plan looks like. This is a great quote from Trey Gowdy. You can get a lot more out of someone when you want to talk to you, when they want to talk to you, not when they feel forced to. A lot of times, whether it's an interview where you hold the keys to the opportunity that gives them a livelihood, that's a very, I have to talk to you to get to what I want. And a lot of times we see this in one on one conversations that start out with the intention of being more transformational, but because we're not self aware of our natural bent to go to very task oriented conversations, they can go from a conversation about the team members' goals or what they've been able to accomplish. And it kind of makes this shift over time, not in a single sitting, but over time. A lot of times, what I see is it turns into an operational checklist or punch list of what did you do? What didn't you do? How can I remove the barriers to get you to the thing that I get, you know, the results for my department, my team, the organization, whatever it might be. We need to be aware that this is a natural temptation for ourselves. So, as managers, we need to take the shift from managing our people to leading our people. And then begin with shared humanity. I wasn't a bite Seinfeld uh, fan growing up, but the quote that comes to me is the sound bite of "Oh, the humanity," and that's not a great Seinfeld voice, but you get the point. Um, we have to start by noticing something authentic, mutual interest, environment, or past experience. This signals that you see them as a person, not as a source. A source meaning you're trying to fill a role, you're trying to get a job done, you're trying to deliver on a deadline. I I say this a lot, both in my house as parents. I also say it in the professional setting, but the greatest gift that we can give somebody is the ability to be seen, the ability to be known. And so if we create these serendipitous collisions in our workday, in our home life, to where we are we are seeing from a shared humanity first. In an interview scenario, it could sound something like this example. I saw your recent post about leading your team through a tough change. That really resonated with me. And we'll get into this a little bit later in this conversation, but framing up the the conversation. Seeing something that they posted. This is an opportunity, an easy opportunity, because we're going to do the research on a candidate anyway. But giving somebody just the shared experience that you see them, that you notice them, that you acknowledge something about them will get you a lot of credibility, not only in the interview, but even in a one-on-one or performance review type of conversation. Also, on the less attractive side, I almost said negative side, but the less attractive side, when we have to take a team member through a disciplinary journey to get them realigned with the organization or realign to the role that they've been given, coming from a shared place of humanity, a shared experience, something that you've noticed will get you a lot more credibility in that conversation because you're going to make a difficult ask at the end. Acknowledge their role or expertise. People open up when they feel seen, when they feel respected. I think if we're really honest with ourselves, whether it's a significant other or a team member or the owner of the organization or a colleague, when they acknowledge that you've done a great job and it's not required, it's pretty impactful. I I do this with my kids. It's one of those little things that I hope they take away from their 18 years of in-home engagement with me. But being seen, when, like, an example is yesterday, unprompted, my son walked into the kitchen and unloaded the dishwasher without even being asked. It's not even his week, so it was somebody else's week to manage the kitchen. And I know that sounds funny to some people, but we have roles that rotate. So every 5 weeks you manage the kitchen, and the goal being that they learn how to own a home. They learn those core attributes of what it means to adult well. But that aside, he walked into the kitchen, unloaded the dishwasher. I share a wall with the kitchen, and so I heard this and a little bit dumbfounded. But when I got done with that meeting that I was on, I walked out and I just acknowledged, hey, I appreciate you seeing a need, filling a need. And that was a huge help for the person that is managing the kitchen, which less than 24 hours ago, they were at each other, which is sibling stuff, but he saw something that needed to be done and he did it without being prompted and just acknowledging that stuff. An example would be you've been in this space longer than most. I really value your take on what's changing. We've recently blended families and we are stitching this thing together. But my son has been in this environment where the expectations are different. Um, so for him to take on that leadership role was very impactful for me, but it also shows that he's starting to develop those leadership qualities at 14 that I want to see him execute on, whether that's in the military, which looks like his journey, or it's college, or a career in the trades. Whatever he decides to do, I want him to be able to lead himself and then lead others well. Ask permission to ask. This seems like such a silly thing, but it's so impactful. I know I've done some trainings with some of you where I will ask for permission to be transparent, or I'll ask permission to share difficult news. This small step builds psychological safety and shifts control to the hearer. So it's less about me telling you the things that you did wrong, and it's more about, hey, do I have permission to give you some feedback? And the hearer will have permission to say yes or no or not right now. The most powerful piece of this is that I've been leveraging this for probably around 5 years now, and it was an absolute game changer. I've taught this to leaders, I've taught this to colleagues, I've taught this to really anybody that will listen. But most importantly, I've leveraged this in leading teams. And when you're in those growth conversations, the more difficult conversations, do I have permission to offer some feedback, or does it make sense to schedule something for tomorrow? It gives them permission to say, yes, I'm open to feedback based on where they are emotionally. Maybe they came into the day and they've just been beat to hell by clients or by coworkers or the stress of the day, and they're not. We can all say we've not been ready to hear whatever difficult feedback somebody else has for us, whether we're in a bad mood or we've just had a tough day of getting consistent blows. Giving them permission, it transfers ownership to where they're now the one in the driver's seat of receiving that feedback and being able to act upon it. Would it be okay if I ask a few questions to better understand where you're coming from? Sometimes just this simple nudge and transfer of ownership will give us the foot in the door to lead our people well. Show you have done the homework. I can't tell you. This kind of goes back to building on the foundation of uh, really seeing people for the human that they are in front of us. Reference something specific about their work, business, or point of view. I noticed blank. Fill in that blank. It's been such an impactful piece to not only my leadership of people, whether that's at home or at work, client or internal, being able to just show them that I care enough to invest prior to my time with them that they're able to say, okay, if Kirk's going to show up prepared, then I can engage in this conversation. When I read about your acquisition strategy, I was curious how you prioritized cultural alignment. Whether this is reading through resumes, looking at LinkedIn, looking at Facebook or other social media platforms, I want people to know that I care about our time enough to where I've invested prior to having the opportunity to be in the same room with them. So show that you've done the homework and it will pull people into the conversation with you. And then be vulnerable first. This is a difficult one, but offer a personal insight, a belief, a story before expecting openness. Hey, when I was in this situation, dot, dot, dot. Um, in my past experience, this is how I've handled fill in the blank. I've had to make some hard calls with incomplete data before. It's something I'm still working on. Vulnerability. I haven't mastered this. I'm not perfect at it. I'm curious how you have navigated that in the past. I'm making myself vulnerable by saying, hey, I've had some hard decisions to make in the past. I've done some hard things. I'm still working on it, vulnerability. I'm putting myself on the altar of your ears. And then I'm curious how you've navigated in the past. I'm asking for their insight. But mostly, I'm building a foundation of trust. I think it's really important for all of us as hearers to not see rapport as this fluffy thing that we hear in sales training, that we have to build rapport, we have to notice something in their office and make a comment about it, we have to do some arbitrary thing to quote unquote build rapport. Rapport is building respect on the basis of trust. And so the better we can get at doing this, the better we're going to have quality conversations. You don't earn the right to ask hard questions until you show you care enough to listen to the simple answers. Deep breath on that one. I think sometimes as supervisors, as managers, as leaders, we feel we are owed the opportunity to just ask hard questions because we are the manager, we are the leader. We assume respect. We assume the right to ask whatever we want. And quite frankly, we do have that right. We can ask whatever we want. But if we want to have implementation that leads to execution, that leads to profitability, we have to earn the right to ask hard questions. And we don't earn that until we're willing to show that we care enough about listening to the simple answers. The how is your day? I want each one of you to try in the next 24 hours to ask 5 people how their day is. And this is the way I want you to ask it. How is your day going? Not how is your day, not are you having a good day? How is your day going? And I want you to pause and listen for the answer because this is free rapport at your disposal. Listen for the answer. Once you get the answer, step into that answer. You may only have 3 minutes before your next call. Put a timeline and a pin in it. Your biggest fear in asking something like that is, my day's not going well, or everything seems to be going to shit. Logan, I appreciate that honesty. I'm seriously bummed to hear that, but I've got time at 4:30. Let me put some time on my calendar. I'll invite you to it. We'll do a 15-minute touch base because I want to hear more and see if there's anything that I can do to make the second half of your day better than the first half. It's getting those little moments that we typically pass by, whether it's in an elevator or passing somebody in the hall at the office or seeing somebody in the shop as they load up the truck. Taking those little moments, getting the buy-in from your team, but really creating these opportunities to listen to the simple answers. Here's the activity, the training that I want you to do. Ask me anything. Make this something of a AMA warm-up drill. Do this at the beginning or end of a meeting. Hey, I want to put myself on the altar of your ears. Ask me anything. It could be role specific. It could be uh, job specific. It could be day specific. And then I want you to think through creating rapport with your people. What makes you trust a question? I will tell you, based on past experiences, that's the filter that you and everybody that you lead is putting your question through. Whether you come into this training full of optimism and unbelievably positive past experiences, or you've had a series of negative experiences, whether personally or professionally, those are the filters that you're putting your questions through. But think of it bigger because those are the filters that your people are putting your questions through. So until you've earned trust, whether in the day or in your role, what makes you trust a question? The first time you hear a question from a superior or your owner or a colleague that sits laterally to you, think through in a quiet place, where do I go when I hear a question? Do I get defensive that, of course I know the answer to that. Of course I did that. Why are you asking me this? Or do I come from a place of, let me fill the question with an answer and then ask for any follow-up. So make those activities over the next 5 days as we jump into the next phase of this. I want to pause right here before we jump into the next section. What questions do we have? No questions. Everybody's acing it. I love that for all of us.
Kirk, I'll jump
Well,
in with
with that, I know we are about 15 minutes out. I'm going to try to cruise as much as I can through this next section, but I also want to just say right here that this is going to be continued next week. So come back for the next half of this because we've got essentially another 2 sessions purely on structuring questions and interviewing and having these conversations that matter to the trajectory of your business. So let's jump back in. So questions that work. If you had a series of questions that worked, would you ask them? Or would you sit back and just stay with what you've done before? Because if it's not broke, don't fix it. If you don't know it's broken, are you willing to fix it? If you don't know it's broken, are you willing to acknowledge that it's broken or potentially might be broken? So structuring questions that work. So I want us to learn how to design open-ended questions with direction. We want to use question stacks to guide people towards insight or decision. So conversations should have an outcome. Um, Again, everything that we teach, everything that we preach, we've already practiced. This is something that we do in almost intuitively in business, in some way, how, shape, form. It seems to lose traction when we go into our home life. I, maybe it's my ADD. I get it. That might just be a me struggle, but I thrive in structure. My kids strive in structure. So every conversation that we have, whether it's a small conversation or it's a big conversation, easy conversation, difficult conversation, every conversation ends with an action plan or an action needing to be taken. And I will have the hearer, the executor, the one that I'm transitioning that ownership to repeat what the action is or what the expectation is. That gives us clarity walking away from that conversation to invoke accountability and discipline into the conversation. So, one of the things that I would encourage each one of you, whether this is personally or professionally, get in the habit of walking away from your conversations with action plans, with actions needing to be taken. Doesn't have to be documented. That's my preference. But it doesn't have to be documented. I will give you some grace. But practice framing, getting the setup right before you ask. So, how do you frame up a question? How do you frame up the difficult things that might be shared before you ask the question? So, that's what we're going to get into. So, the power of open ended questions. Some of you have gone through some asking open ended questions training. Some of it has been applied to sales training. Some of it has been applied to one on ones, performance reviews, interviews. The reality is that you're not going to get away from this. If you don't start your questions with why, when, what, how, where, stop. Stop the question. If you hear yourself asking a close-ended question, stop yourself. Ask for permission to re-ask the question. And I do this regularly. I did it a lot more regularly when I started working on this back in 2011, 2012, when I was coming through with a lot of these concepts. But open-ended questions are the lifeblood of your communication. So why, when, what, how, where? Additional questions. Walk me through it. Help me understand. Help me understand. ... Fill in the open-ended question. I'm curious about open-ended question. Open-ended questions require an answer and removes the opportunity for yes, no, maybe to be a credible answer. I'm going to pick on kids because that's the easy target here, but we all have had team members, we've had employees, we've had colleagues, we've had co-leaders that we've asked a closed-ended question and we get yes, no, maybe, and it gets us nowhere further towards the target. I'm seeing some head nods, so I'm going to take that as you agree. But the reality is that if we just go into our home with our kids, our spouse, whatever that may look like for you, if you ask a closed-ended question and your kid gives you a yes, no, maybe, I don't know, you've set them up as the hearer, as the listener, to either fall short of expectation or fail. When you ask an open-ended question, you're creating an opportunity for them to speak into what you've just asked. Meaning, you've now acknowledged that you've noticed them, you've taken notice of them, you've made them known to the room. You're asking an open-ended question and leveraging the information that they know, leveraging their expertise. If we're truly honest with ourselves, doesn't matter how humble you are as a leader, if somebody leverages your expertise, the thing that you've poured in that 10,000 hours to get expertise in, it feels good. It feels good. Doesn't mean you're not humble, doesn't mean you're not a servant leader, but it feels good. And so we want to give that opportunity to our listener as well. So, question stacking, this might be a new concept for some of us, but building question stacks to guide towards insight or decision. A question stack is a series of layered questions. A lot of times, what we do is we will ask a question and there's no further curiosity. When we stack questions, we build understanding, we create reflection, and then we lead somebody to a logical or emotional conclusion without telling them what to think. That's the beautiful thing is we don't have to tell somebody what to think or what to do. We can lead them through questions. I want you to try this. Ask an open-ended question. Maybe it's a task, maybe it's a reflective type question, but ask an open-ended question. Logan, what do you think about, huh, that's interesting. How did you come to that conclusion? What led you to that? And then wait for the answer. That's that that's a perspective I'm not familiar with. Can you tease that out a little bit more so I can understand dot dot dot? What I'm doing is I am getting deep before I go wide. A lot of times, our conversations, whether it's personally or professionally, we have these wide conversations we walk away from, and there's no depth. It's just surface level stuff. If you've ever walked away from a conversation and you feel like you've talked through a myriad of topics and you've covered a lot of ground and yet you have zero clarity, that is a indication of your deficit in driving the conversation through the art of asking. So when we stack these questions, it's a technique that builds buy-in through discovery rather than persuasion. If you've ever been in one of those, I'll pick on car salesmen just because that's an easy target. We've all been part of a sales transaction or a lease transaction with an automobile where it's just high pressure. You know, every question is leading you to making a buying decision. And it's like, dude or dudette, seriously, I know where you're going with this. And that is persuasion. They're trying to get you to your first five yeses, and then they ask for agreement, and then you sign on the dotted line. It's this, you know, series of whatever it is. When we stack our questions, when we build these question stacks, we're actually getting deeper before we get wide. When we do an interview with all true candidates, I will tell you, and just doing interviewing really very intensely over the last 3 or 4 weeks, I've had multiple candidates reach out after the interview and say, I know we've never met, but I feel like I've known you forever because of the conversation we've had. That's powerful. If you have somebody that, whether they join your team or not, can acknowledge that they've had a genuine connection with you, you're doing something right. Even if they're not qualified for the position or not culturally aligned with where you're going as an organization, if somebody can say and feel a genuine connection between you as the interviewer or you as the leader and them as the participant in that conversation, you have you have impacted and imprinted on their life in a profound way. So framing, this idea of framing, getting the structure right before you ask. So starting with intent, what are you trying to understand or solve? Most of the time, I see people asking questions, they don't actually know where they're going with the question. One of the fun things that I do with my older kids, so kids being 12 and up, is what are you trying to solve for with your question? Because they'll ask questions, and I welcome questions. We're an open question kind of household. But where are you going with the question? The great thing about framing is you're taking that question of your here out of the equation. What you're trying to understand or solve. The tone. I have two teenage girls. I've got a, an adult daughter as well. And not to pick on them, but they have more tone than they do pitch. And so we focus a lot of our parental coaching on tonality. A lot of times with leaders, I'm coaching tonality. Instead of the words that they're using, it's how are you coming across? How are you presenting yourself? Is it respectful? Is it collaborative? Does it have any hint of judgment or recourse baked into it? And if it does, we want to get the frame right to where our tone is coming from that genuine place of curiosity. And then process. How do you plan to engage? A few questions, dialogue, explanatory, really helping the hearer, that 7 out of 10 hearers that we have that are high S on the disc. They need information, they need stability, they need support, they need to feel that firm foundation under them. So how do you plan to engage? Creating those open-ended questions, creating dialogue, creating vulnerability on the front end of those questions before you get the right to ask the hard questions. We're getting the permission by answering the easy ones. So framing, this can sound like in an interview structure. Thanks again for taking time to talk with us today. My goal is to get a clear picture of how you approach decision making and leadership under pressure. I'm going to ask a few scenario based questions. I'm not looking for perfect answers, just honest reflection. And then I get into my questions. So now I've dropped the barrier coming into the interview. Because if you've been in an interview, and most of us have, whether you've been in an interview in the last 60 days or the last 6 years or the last 6 months, it does not matter. A lot of times we forget what it's like to be on the other side of that desk. And so coming from that place of humanity, addressing the person that's in front of us, we want to frame out that conversation. Logan, I appreciate you taking the time with me today. This is going to be a great conversation. I'm prepared to ask you a lot of scenario based questions. I want to get clarity on how I can set you best up for success, whether that's in ABC Company or if it's in your future endeavors. I want to make sure that you are set up for success. Now, as the interviewer in this scenario, I'm advocating for them. Whether I hire them or not, they know that I am advocating for their success. That creates this openness to them engaging into the conversation. This is setting the tone, and you've heard it before, but I'll say it again. You have an environment, you create a culture, and you have a culture by design or by default, and you drive that as a leader. This is priming the pump on the interview side of the equation to create that culture by design. And then lastly, in a performance review, so we have an ongoing relationship with this team member now. We've had more than 12 months, or at least more than 6 months of this relationship on this side of the employee employer relationship. If you've ever been in a performance review with a poor leader, you know the tension that enters the room. The performance review, a lot of times, is attached to merit increases or raises. I want to unbuckle those things from each other. And what I want to do is I want this to be purely about the team member's performance, a look back, and a look forward. So going back to coming out of a conversation with an action plan, each one of my performance reviews, we reflect on the last 6 to 12 months, depending on their tenure with the business. But then we're looking forward the next 12 months. And I want them to know that there's been forethought put into this process to where I'm creating a 12-month action plan for you to develop as a person, as a leader. I want you to hit your target 12 goals over the next 12 months. And the only way for you to do that is if I'm personally invested in your professional success. So this is a space for open dialogue. I want to set the tone. There's no judgment. I want to understand how things have been going from your perspective before we talk about goals or changes that we're going to make. I'll be asking some reflective style questions to get your honest take. I'm 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 framing the question out. So before I start my questions and start that deeper dialogue, I'm setting a frame for our time together. So it drops those barriers, it builds trust, and it gets alignment. So with that, I'll stop here before we jump into the third section of interviewing like your business depends on it. And if we have any questions before we jump off, I want to take those and get those on the table. Perfect. I'm going to take the silence as clarity, and the clarity is confidence, and the confidence as your willingness to execute at a deeper level. So, with that, thanks for joining. Thanks for your engagement. I hope this was valuable time, and I will see you next time for the continuation of this conversation on interview like your business depends on it next week. Have a great second half of your week. Have impact.